welcome to our first study in the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 1, so if you have a Bible, go ahead and grab that. And if you have a notebook, something to write down, take some notes, that could be helpful, so go ahead and grab that. And once you get those items, sit down, take a deep breath, and let's spend some time on the Word of God together. Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 1, says this: The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now jump all the way down to verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. What we have here at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew is a genealogy. Now, in our culture, if you want to get to know about someone, what questions do you ask? We ask questions like this. The first one is, where are you from? Are you from Houston? Are you from Dallas? Because if we know where you're from, we can know a little bit more about you. Or if you're from a foreign country, if you're from like China or Europe, we get to know a little bit more about you. It's an identifier. Where are you from? It gives us a little bit of an identifier of who you are, what you're like. The second question we often ask is this: what do you do? What's your job? What's your occupation? Are you a student, a teacher, an engineer? Because if we can know a little bit about what you do, we can know a little bit more about you. It's like an identifier. But in the first century, they didn't ask really those two questions: where are you from and what do you do? They asked the question, who's your dad? Where are you from? What's your family line? Because especially in the Jewish culture, your family line determined a lot about you. Your family line showed what the distribution of land would be. If you look at some old maps in the back of your Bible, particularly during the early part of the patriarchs, what you'll see is that the land was divided up by families. And so family line determined what land you would get. There's another part with the family line is that it determined the priesthood. So the Levitical priests all came through the line of Levi, and so they know that for worship of God to happen, the Levites would need to administer the worship, and so it determined how you worshiped God. But there's a third big reason why they wanted to know the family line of Jesus. As they watched Jesus' life, Matthew was writing to first century Christians that had watched Jesus live his life, perform the miracles, die, rise from the dead. And so the question they're asking is, Jesus, are you the promised king that we're expecting? What's your family of origin? See, the Jews, they expected a line of kings coming through a very specific family line. And so they're asking, Jesus, did you fulfill those Old Testament promises about the coming Messiah, the coming king? And so Matthew, at the very beginning of this gospel, writing to Jewish Christians, is saying, yes, this is who he is. And he starts out with two major characters, two titanic personalities of the Old Testament. One of them is Abraham. It says the son of Abraham. Now, Abraham is what I call the OJ, the original Jew, the first Jewish person. And Abraham, through him, he was given three big promises. Through you, you will get this land, the nation of Israel, the physical land property of Israel. You would get seed. You would have descendants, but in particular, a major descendant who'd be significant, and you would be a blessing. It says, through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so the first kind of question they're asking is, are you from the right family line? Are you part of the promises of God? And secondly, it says, the son of David. Now, David was the amazing, beloved king of the Old Testament. He was the second king of the nation of Israel, and he was called a man after God's own heart. And God gave some very specific promises to David and his descendants. He said, the kingdom will always be through your family line. And when you read in Isaiah chapter 11 in the Old Testament, there's some major promises and expectations given to the line of kings from David. In particular, one king. In the line of David, there would be a root who would bring peace on earth like we've never experienced or seen. And so by the time we get to the first century, there's a lot of messianic expectation, king expectation for the nation of Israel. And they're asking themselves the question, okay, Jesus, are you this king in the line of David? And Matthew is saying emphatically, yes. He is from the line of kings. He is who he claimed to be. But there's a second thing that we see in this gospel as you jump all the way down to verse 17 in this genealogy. You see that Jesus came as part of 3 sets of 14 generations. From Abraham to David, there's 14 generations. From David to the deportation of Babylon is 14 generations. And from the deportation of Babylon to Christ, there's 14 generations. And what you see in that reality is something very significant. See, this genealogy is pointing to the King, Jesus, who came. But you see something about how God works in bringing about his King. And if we understand how God works, we can understand how we can have comfort even in our circumstances right now. So the first thing that we see from this is this, that God has been working behind the scenes. I mean, look at all these names in the Old Testament. You see all of these people that you probably don't know personally. Many of these people, you may not even have read their names before. But although they're not significant to us, they're clearly significant to God because he used them in the line to bring about his King. See, God has been working for centuries through people's lives to arrange them, to bring them into his family so that he could bring about his greater promises. He is working intentionally through the lives of individuals. I love watching movies. And over this time of COVID-19, we've been watching a lot of movies as a family. And what's interesting when you watch a movie, most of us tend to focus on the main character or the main characters. So if you're watching Avengers, you pick your favorite Avenger. It may be Chris Hemsworth, and you're like, oh yeah, I'm just a champion for Thor, and that's who you focus on. If you're watching old movies from the 90s, maybe Will Smith battling aliens, you're like, okay, I'm just focusing on Will Smith, whether he's battling aliens in After Earth or battling aliens in Independence Day, like that's your focus. Or if you're like me, when I was growing up, I loved the movie series Indiana Jones, and so Harrison Ford is the hero, and so that's who you focus on. But if you watch the entire movie and you watch all the way to the very end, you'll see credits. And in modern movies, it feels like the credits are just as long as the movie itself. I mean, there's so many people listed. And what you see when you look at the credits is there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of people working together to bring about this great event. And when we look at the genealogy of Jesus, what we see is that God has been arranging circumstances, God has been arranging people, God is utilizing them in significant ways as part of his greater story. And the same is true in our day. Even if we don't know exactly how God is working, we can have confidence that God can be using our lives to bring about his greater purposes as part of his greater story. A couple weeks ago, I was watching a YouTube video online, and it showed a church that had all gone to this hospital in Georgia. And they had all arranged it so that they would all be listening to the same song at the same moment. And the purpose was to have kind of a worship moment at this hospital that's treating all of these victims of coronavirus. And as they're all in this parking lot, in their cars, individually practicing social distancing, they start playing this song called Waymaker. And as the video continues, you see people from the hospital coming up on top of the hospital and standing safe social distance away, 6 to 10 feet away from one another, and praising Jesus together. And I'm watching this and I'm just getting stirred emotionally. And I want to read a couple of the lyrics. It says this: even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. I love that simple reminder that God, you are working to bring about your greater plan, even if right now I'm at home and I don't know exactly how you're going to be fixing this situation. I don't know how you're viewing this situation. I can know that you are working even if I don't see it. The second reality that we see is this, that God is restoring lives along the way. Not only is God working for his greater plan, from the genealogy, we see that God is restoring lives along the way. There's 4 women listed here. There's Tamar in verse 3. There's Rahab in verse 5. There's Ruth in verse 5 and Mary in verse 16. And if you look at those first 3 women, and if you were to read about their past, you would be surprised. They all came from dark, questionable histories. If you read about Tamar and some of the things that she did in her life, you'd be like, man, that's kind of, those are like inappropriate actions. If you looked at Rahab and her background, you'd say, man, that's rough. You look at Ruth, she was a Moabitess. She wasn't a Jew. And some of the practices of the Moabites, they were very questionable. But all of those women are listed in the genealogy of Jesus. That's fascinating. That God would take these people that were far from him and bring them literally into his family. See, God is working through the lives of people. He is bringing about his greater plan. But even in the midst of that, he's restoring lives along the way. He's fixing things in people's lives because he loves people. See, right now, God, in this crisis, is actually bringing people to himself. One of the pastor's wives shared a newspaper article with us, and it said that many people during this crisis are actually questioning, God, are you real? Are you active? Can I know you in this circumstance? God right now is restoring lives. And what we need to do is just take our head up from our circumstances, look around and say, God, who are you working in right now? Who can I pray for right now? Who could I help like you're helping right now? Our church is starting several initiatives where we're moving into the community to try to help families that are hurting in this moment. And I love the stories that we're beginning to hear about helping the school district get supplies and food to different people. And those partnerships are helping us to move in and do the type of work that God does to help restore people in right relationship with him. And the third thing we see is this, that God himself is coming near. Jump all the way down to verse 23. We see that Jesus was born to Mary. And as he's promised to Mary, an angel says, I want to tell you about this new king that's coming. He's significant. He's different. Verse 23, it says this, Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and he shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. That's significant. That's different. See, they were expecting a king that would come, that would be a bit of a conqueror. They weren't expecting God incarnate. See, Jesus stepped down from glory. He was eternally God and stepped into human history to become God with us. He wanted to be near us, to restore us in right relationship with our Heavenly Father and to be with us. See, right now, the biggest thing that you probably need, the biggest thing that I need, is to be near to God. And during this season, I think the greatest gift that we can use with the isolation, the social isolation that we have, is an opportunity to draw near to God. So if you haven't done that during this season, my encouragement to you is you utilize this time well. You're probably not going to have this much isolation ever again in life, hopefully. But we could actually utilize this time to draw near to God, and he promises he will draw near to us. He is working behind the scenes. He is restoring lives along the way. And right now, we can draw near to him. Thank you so much for joining us in this first installment of the Gospel of Matthew. I'm excited to see what God's going to do in your life and in my life as we study this word together. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great day.